Welcome. There is nothing that needs doing right now. Whatever the day was, it is behind you now and you can set it down. The blanket is fine where it is. The pillow is fine. The room is whatever it is. Nothing requires your adjustment or your attention except this, a slow, careful, unhurried account of what ordinary daily life looked like for ordinary people who were not soldiers, who stayed at home, who got on with the unremarkable business of living through a war. Not the dramatic civilian experience, not the bombings and the evacuations, though those things happened to many people. The daily version, the version most people lived most of the time, the rationing and the queuing and the small adjustments and the making do and the daily management of a life that had been altered in specific and persistent ways by the fact that a war was happening somewhere and perhaps quite near. We are going to take our time. This is that kind of story. Let us begin in the morning in a terraced house in a British city sometime in the middle years of the war, 1942 or 1943, when the immediate terror of the Blitz had subsided for most people, but the war was clearly far from over, when the shortages were established facts of daily life and not new adjustments. The woman who lives in this house, we will call her Margaret, wakes in the morning as she is woken every morning, at roughly the same time, in roughly the same way, the light coming through the blackout curtains at whatever angle the season produces. The blackout curtains were one of the most pervasive features of British wartime domestic life. Heavy, usually black or very dark, they covered every window in every house, and were required by law to be fully closed from dusk to dawn. The penalty for allowing light to show was the attention of the ARP warden, the air raid precautions warden who patrolled the streets at night checking for violations and potentially a fine. The blackout curtains changed the house's relationship with the outside world. The windows, which in peacetime admitted both light and the view, became opaque barriers. The house was more sealed, more interior, more separate from the street. The morning when the blackout curtains could finally be opened brought a specific relief. The return of the outside, the light, the view of the street that was part of the ordinary domestic texture of the day. Margaret opens the blackout curtains. The street outside is the street she has known for many years. The same terraced houses, the same pavement, the same lampposts that no longer illuminate at night, the same small front gardens that some neighbours have converted to vegetable growing, because the government has strongly encouraged this, the Dig for Victory campaign urging everyone with any garden space to use it for food production. Her own small front garden has its row of carrots and another of onions and a patch of lettuce at the front. The back garden, behind the house, has been more extensively converted. Potatoes, runner beans, cabbages, swede. These vegetables supplemented the ration, and the supplementation of the ration was one of the central occupations of the wartime household. The ration. Let us spend time with the ration, because the ration was the organising principle of wartime domestic life in Britain and in many other countries, and because understanding it in detail is essential to understanding what the civilian experience of the war was like. The British rationing system was introduced in January 1940 and was gradually expanded as the war continued. By the middle years of the war, the ration covered bacon and ham, butter, sugar, meat, tea, jam, cheese, eggs, milk, and various other foods that were available only in controlled quantities to each person each week. The specific quantities varied by item and changed over the course of the war as supply conditions changed, but to give a sense of the scale, in 1942, each person's weekly ration included approximately 4 ounces of bacon or ham, 2 ounces of butter, 8 ounces of sugar, 1 shilling's worth of meat. A shilling was enough to buy perhaps a pound of the cheaper cuts, 2 ounces of tea, 2 ounces of jam, 1 ounce of cheese, and 1 egg per fortnight, though sometimes less. This was not starvation. British nutritionists and the Ministry of Food worked carefully to ensure that the ration provided adequate calories and nutrition. But it was considerably less food than most British households had been accustomed to, and the management of the household's ration required planning and ingenuity that peacetime domestic life had not demanded in the same way. The ration book was the document that organised all of this. Each member of the household had a ration book, a small booklet of coupons, each coupon representing 1 week's allocation of a specific rationed item. When you bought rationed food, you gave the shopkeeper the relevant coupon from your book along with the payment. When the coupon was gone, it was gone. There was no more of that item until the next week's allocation. Margaret's ration books, one for herself, one for each of her 2 children who are still at home, plus the book for her husband who is in the factory doing war work and brings his to her to manage, are kept in a specific place in the kitchen drawer, carefully. The loss of a ration book was a bureaucratic inconvenience of some magnitude, and required a trip to the food office to arrange a replacement, which took time and required explanation. The morning begins with the consideration of the ration, not formally, not with a written calculation. But the experienced wartime housewife carried a running inventory of what remained, what had been used, what was needed, what could be substituted, what could be managed without. This inventory was mental, updated continuously. The information immediately available: today there is enough butter for breakfast toast and nothing else. The butter ration is nearly used. This week's allocation of meat has been spent. There is a piece of salt beef left from the weekend's joint that can be used for something. Eggs. 1 egg remaining from the fortnight's allocation. Potatoes from the garden. No sugar to spare. The breakfast she makes with what is available. Toast from the national loaf, the wartime bread made from a higher extraction flour than peacetime bread, slightly greyish in colour and denser in texture, not as pleasant as the white bread of peacetime, but perfectly adequate, spread thinly with the remaining butter. Tea, made weak to make the tea ration go further. For the children, the national loaf with margarine, because margarine was somewhat more available than butter, and with the scraping of the jam ration. The national loaf was one of the more persistent small irritants of wartime domestic life for people who had been accustomed to white bread. Not terrible. Many people came to find it acceptable. A nutritionist pointed out that it was more nutritious than the white bread it replaced, but different, and the difference was noticed and commented upon regularly in the diary entries and letters of the period. The tea was important. As we noted when discussing the soldiers' experience, tea for the British was a genuine morale factor, rather than simply a beverage. The tea ration was 2 ounces per person per week, which was less than peacetime consumption for many households. Making the tea ration last required making each pot weaker and each cup smaller. The habit of the strong, liberally poured cup of tea had to be managed differently. Margaret poured her morning cup and made it do. After breakfast, the day's first significant task, shopping. Shopping in wartime Britain was not the occasional supermarket expedition of modern life. It was a daily or near-daily activity because refrigeration was limited and quantities were small and planning required knowing what was available. Each week brought its routine shopping, the butcher for the meat ration, the grocer for the various other rationed items, the greengrocer for vegetables, the queuing. Queuing became one of the defining social experiences of wartime Britain. When a shop received a delivery of something desirable, fresh fish, which was not rationed but was scarce, dried fruit, onions, which were in short supply much of the war, word spread quickly through the neighbourhood and a queue formed. The queue was not always orderly, but it was generally respected. The social contract of the queue, that those who arrived earlier deserved priority over those who arrived later, was maintained with some care because the alternative, the chaos of first come first served without queue discipline, was worse for everyone. Margaret had become adept at the queue. She knew which shops to check first on which days. She knew which of the neighbours had useful information about deliveries. She had developed the patient, accepting relationship with waiting that the queue required. You stood, you moved forward slowly, you reached the front, you bought what was available, which might or might not be what you had hoped for. You went to the next shop. The queue was not entirely unpleasant. It was social in a specific wartime way. The women in the queue, it was mostly women, because women managed the domestic provisioning of the household, talked while they waited. They exchanged information, what was available at which shops, which recipes had worked well with the available ingredients, how various people's husbands or sons in the forces were faring according to the latest letter, the various small news of the street and the neighbourhood. The community of the queue was one of the communities that wartime created or intensified. The specific community of people managing the same material constraints in the same neighbourhood, the shared conversation about how to manage well within the limitations. After the shopping came the cooking. The cooking of wartime rationed meals was a genuine creative challenge, and one that the Ministry of Food addressed with considerable seriousness. The Ministry produced recipe leaflets, ran cooking demonstrations, published the kitchen front broadcasts on the radio, a daily 5-minute segment in the morning after the news, aimed at housewives and giving tips for managing the ration and making the most of whatever was available. The kitchen front programme was enormously popular, not because it was entertaining, it was practical rather than entertaining, but because it addressed a genuine daily need. What do you do when you have half a pound of salt beef, some potatoes from the garden, a handful of carrots, and a small amount of cooking fat? The kitchen front had an answer, or several answers, and the answers were tested and workable. The wartime recipes that emerged from this period were ingenious responses to constraint. Mock cream, made from margarine and sugar whisked together for occasions requiring something resembling cream. Woolton pie, named after Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food, a pastry-topped vegetable pie that required no rationed ingredients and was filling if somewhat austere. Carrot cake, using grated carrot for sweetness when sugar was scarce. The powdered egg omelette, which was not an omelette in the peacetime sense, but was an edible egg-like preparation that the powdered egg ration could produce. Powdered egg, dried egg powder imported primarily from the United States, was one of the more controversial ration components. Some people came to use it without complaint. incorporating it into their recipes without reference to the fresh egg experience. Others found it an inadequate substitute, specifically because the texture and flavour that fresh eggs produced in cooking, the binding, the richness, were not fully replicated by the powder. A real egg was a genuine luxury, used with care. Margaret made the meal that the available ingredients permitted, not the meal she might have chosen, the meal that used what there was efficiently and produced enough to feed the household adequately. This practical cooking intelligence, the constant adjustment of recipes to available ingredients, the perpetual substitution of what you had for what the recipe specified, the development of a repertoire of dishes that worked within the constraints, was one of the skills that wartime domestic life developed in the women who managed it. Let us now think about the other occupations of the wartime civilian day. Many women in Britain were, by this middle period of the war, also working outside the home. The demands of the war economy for labour had drawn large numbers of women into paid work, in factories producing munitions and other war materials, in transport, in clerical and administrative roles, that men had vacated when they entered the forces. Margaret works 3 mornings a week at a local factory that has converted to war production. What it made before the war is not our concern here. What it makes now is a component for something larger, and the women on Margaret's line perform a specific repetitive operation that has been designed to be learned quickly and performed consistently without specialized engineering training. The factory work was physically tiring, standing at the bench for 3 or 4 hours, performing the same operation repeatedly. Not intellectually demanding, but requiring sustained attention. The quality of the component mattered, and components that did not meet specification were rejected, and too many rejections meant the supervisor's attention. The factory had its own community, its own social texture. The women on the line talked while they worked, the conversation continuous in the way that conversation at repeated physical work tends to be, not requiring full attention, running alongside the work, picking up and putting down as the work required. The conversations covered family news, the same ration management topics that appeared in the Q conversations, the news of the war as it filtered through the newspapers and the radio, the specific gossip of the factory itself. Who had been promoted? Who had received bad news about a husband or a son in the forces, who was having a difficult time and might benefit from some practical help? The wartime factory had an informal support system among the workers that was another expression of the community that the shared experience of the war created. Women who received bad news, a telegram from the War Office, were supported by the people around them. Time was found, help was offered. Not always perfectly, not in ways that could address the fundamental losses that the war produced, but in the way that people in proximity support each other when they can. Margaret was not particularly unhappy in the factory work. It was tiring and it was repetitive, and it was not what she would have chosen if choices had been available. But it provided income that supplemented the family's finances, which the combination of her husband's factory wage and the small separation allowance from the government managed adequately but without much margin. And it was useful, which mattered. The consciousness that what you were doing was contributing to the war effort that would eventually end. The war was a genuine source of meaning, or could be, for many of the women who did it. In the evenings, Margaret was usually at home. The wartime evenings were organised around the radio and the available fuel for heating. The radio in the wartime British home was as important as the ration book in its own way. It was the primary source of news, the primary source of information about how the war was going, the primary source of entertainment, and the primary mechanism by which the government communicated directly with the population. The BBC's wartime schedule was a careful balance of news, entertainment, and various forms of useful information. The 9 o'clock news was, by the middle years of the war, essential listening for virtually the entire adult population. Not because it was always reassuring. The news from 1942 and 1943 included the fall of Singapore, the difficulties in North Africa, the German advance in the Soviet Union. But because knowing what was happening was considered more manageable than not knowing. The uncertainty about what was happening to family members in the forces was one of the most persistent stresses of civilian life. The letter from the front, when it came, was reassurance that as of the writing, the writer was alive. But the letter was always dated, always weeks or more behind the current situation, and the gap between the letter's date and the present was a space of uncertainty that imagination could fill. The letters that did not come were the worst. A disruption in postal service, a period of intense operations when writing was impossible, the absence of a letter for 2 weeks when a letter usually came every week. These absences were felt with a specific anxiety that was one of the more persistent qualities of the civilian experience of the war. Margaret's husband was not overseas. He was doing essential war work in a factory, in a reserved occupation that had exempted him from military service. This was a relief on one level and a source of some social awkwardness on another, because the cultural pressure on men to serve was real, and men in reserved occupations sometimes encountered the implication that they were not doing their share. The Blitz had made the home front a genuinely dangerous place. The reserved occupation was not a safe harbour in any absolute sense, but the social texture of the question was present. The evenings, the kitchen range or the fireplace, depending on what the house had, provided the heating, and the fuel ration was another calculation. Coal was rationed, and the coal ration had to last. The principle of using the minimum fuel to heat the minimum necessary space was applied, one room heated rather than the whole house. The family gathered in the heated room in the evening. The sitting room or the kitchen, with the range or the fire, was the centre of the winter evening. The family gathered there. Margaret, the 2 children, the husband when he was not on the late shift, occasionally a neighbour or a relative, the radio in the corner, the knitting or the mending on the woman's lap, because idle hands in wartime were somewhat frowned upon, and because the knitting produced useful things, socks for the forces, balaclavas, scarves, the various woolen items that the voluntary knitting campaigns called for. Knitting was one of the more publicly visible of the wartime civilian contributions, the image of women knitting, for the troops, in their sitting rooms, in the queue on public transport, was a genuine part of the wartime experience. Not universal, not every woman knitting constantly, but common enough to be characteristic. The children did their schoolwork at the kitchen table, the homework that needed to be done, the reading that their schools assigned. The children's experience of the war was its own specific thing. The disruption of the evacuation if they had been evacuated, the adjustment to the blackout and the ration and the changed daily life, Children who had grown up entirely in the war years had no clear peacetime reference point. The war was simply the background of their lives. The nightly news on the radio at 9 o'clock, the family sitting in the heated room, the knitting paused, the attention on the announcer's measured voice. The news of the war was listened to with a specific kind of attention, tracking certain names and places that were relevant to specific family members in the forces, noting the tone of the announcer. The BBC's wartime announcers were skilled at maintaining composure while delivering difficult news, calibrating the overall tenor of the situation. After the news, a programme perhaps. Tommy Handley's ITMA, It's That Man Again, was enormously popular. The comedy specific to wartime conditions, the catchphrases that became part of the national vocabulary of the period, the comedian on the radio in the sitting room, the family half listening and half talking over it, the normalcy of entertainment maintained. Let us now think about the specific texture of the blackout. The blackout at night was one of the most dramatic alterations to the civilian environment. The streets, which in peacetime had been lit by gas or electric lamp, were dark. Not just dark, genuinely, completely city dark. The lampposts were unlit. The shop windows were covered. The passing vehicles had their headlights masked to a minimal slit of light. The sky, usually lit from below by the combined glow of a large city's lighting, was dark. Moving through the blacked-out city at night required adjustment. The physical navigation of familiar streets became a matter of memory and touch rather than sight. You knew the curb was there because the curb was always there. You could not see it, but you knew it. The familiar route home from the bus stop became slightly different in the dark, each familiar landmark reduced to a silhouette at best. Falls and collisions were common in the blackout. More people died in road accidents in the early months of the blackout, when drivers, pedestrians and cyclists were all adjusting to the reduced visibility, than were killed in the blitz in those same months. The adjustment was made over time, the population learning to navigate the dark city with the combination of care and familiarity that the experience accumulated. In good moonlight, the blackout city was actually navigable quite well. The moon provided more light than people accustomed to artificial lighting sometimes realized, and a clear full moon made the blacked-out streets pale and visible. The moon was the blackout's friend, and a full moon night was a relatively comfortable night for moving around. But the full moon was also, in the Blitz years, the night most favourable to bombing. Clear sky, bright moon, and the visibility it provided to bomber crews meant that full moon periods were watched with a wariness that no peacetime observer would have associated with moonlight. In the sitting room with the blackout curtains closed and the radio on, and the fire in the grate, the blackout was not felt. The outside was outside. The inside was inside. The family was warm. The specific quality of the wartime interior, sealed against the outside by the blackout, the domestic warmth somewhat constrained by the fuel ration, but domestic, warm, familiar, was one of the more comforting features of the civilian experience. However difficult the day had been, the queue, the shortage, the management of the ration, the factory work, the evenings in the sitting room provided a regular, reliable retreat. The German civilian experience had its own version of this. In Germany, particularly in the major cities, the civilian experience of the war followed a trajectory different from the British experience in its timing and intensity. The initial years of the war, which had gone well for German arms, had not produced the same immediate civilian hardship that Britain experienced from 1940. The German rationing system was less restrictive in the early years. The population's mood was shaped by the rapid German victories, and the sense of the war as a manageable and winning enterprise lasted longer than in Britain. From 1942 onward, the Allied strategic bombing campaign against German cities brought the war to the German civilian in a way that had not been experienced before. The bombing of Hamburg in 1943, the firestorm that killed tens of thousands of people in a single night, was a qualitative shift in what German civilians were experiencing. But between the raids, the daily life of the German housewife also revolved around the ration book and the queue. The German ration was different in its specific quantities and categories. More bread, for example, because Germany's agricultural base was larger and bread grain more available. But the organizing principle was the same. Controlled quantities, registered in a ration book, obtained through registered traders who marked off the coupons. The German housewife in Frankfurt or Hamburg or Berlin was navigating this same fundamental challenge as Margaret in her British city. How to feed a household on limited, controlled supplies, using skill and planning and substitution to make the available ingredients into meals that were adequate and, where possible, palatable. She was also managing the same anxiety about family members in the forces. Germany's vast military campaigns meant that virtually every family had a father or a son or a husband somewhere on the Eastern Front or the Western Front or in the Mediterranean. The letters from the Eastern Front were read with a different kind of attention than letters from elsewhere, because everyone understood that the Eastern Front was the war's most demanding and dangerous theatre, and the distances involved meant that news was older, and the situation it described more likely to have changed by the time the letter arrived. The German civilian radio, the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, a cheap radio set distributed widely to ensure that the government could communicate with the population, carried the news and the propaganda and the entertainment of the German wartime state. The German news, shaped by the propaganda ministry, presented the war differently from the BBC's measured reportage, but the German civilian who had relatives at the front and who could read between the lines of official announcements understood the significance of certain silences and certain omissions. And in the evening, in the kitchen or the sitting room, the German family also sat with whatever heat the fuel supply allowed and listened to the radio and managed the ration. The American civilian experience was substantially different because the war did not come to American territory, with the exception of Pearl Harbor and certain incidents on the American coast. American civilians participated in the war through material sacrifice rather than physical vulnerability. Rationing in the United States was less severe than in Britain, but real. Gasoline, tires, sugar, coffee, meat, butter, canned goods were all rationed. The Victory Garden campaign encouraged American households to grow their own vegetables, just as the British Dig for Victory had. The American civilian woman who stayed at home while her husband served abroad was managing the same practical challenges of rationing and shopping, but without the additional stress of air raids and the additional physical constraint of the blackout. She was also often working. The phrase Rosie the Riveter was a cultural reference to the enormous movement of women into industrial employment in the United States during the war. The millions of women who entered factories producing tanks and planes and ships and the 100 other things the war required. This was a profound shift in the economic and social role of women, both in the United States and in other warring nations, and its effects on women's expectations and opportunities would outlast the war. In the evenings, American families gathered around their radios, as British families did. The American wartime radio schedule was rich. The news programs, the comedy shows, the soap operas that continue through the war, the variety shows that entertained millions, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, the various programs that defined the American wartime culture of entertainment. The Japanese civilian experience of the war was different again, and as the war progressed and Allied bombers reached the Japanese home islands, it became one of the most severe civilian experiences of the war. By 1944 and 1945, the combination of American submarine warfare against Japanese shipping and the air campaign against Japanese cities had produced severe food shortages and widespread destruction. But in the earlier years, the Japanese civilian managed their own rationing system, their own adjustments to the war's demands, their own organization of daily life around the particular constraints that the Japanese war economy imposed. The Q and the ration book appeared in Tokyo as they appeared in London, the specific items different but the organizing principle the same. Let us now return to Margaret's evening and let it wind toward its end. The news was listened to, the programme was half attended, the knitting was set aside when the children needed attention, the children were put to bed, then a cup of tea, weak from the carefully managed ration, and a little more sitting by the fire as it burned down. The day reviewed in the mind, not systematically, but in the drifting way of the evening's last thoughts. The ration for the week, where it stood, what was needed, how the remainder would be managed. The factory shift tomorrow, the letter she needed to write to her husband's mother, who was getting on, and who needed the reassurance of regular contact. The fire dying, the room cooling slightly, the time, it was not late. Fuel was too precious to sit with a dying fire, and the morning came early. The sensible thing was bed. She turned the radio off. She checked the blackout curtains, a reflex by now, a quick visual check that no light was showing around the edges before going upstairs. She climbed the stairs. The children were asleep. She checked them quickly. The small adjustments of the parent, a blanket pulled more fully over a small shoulder, a quiet smoothing of a hair, her own room, the bed. She had been managing this household through 4 years of war, and she was tired in the specific way that sustained management produces. Not the tiredness of physical exertion, but the tiredness of continuous attention, continuous calculation, continuous adjustment to conditions that never fully resolved. She lay down. The room was dark. The blackout from inside was simply darkness. The sounds of the street outside were the sounds of the nighttime street in the blackout. Occasionally a distant vehicle, the sound of footsteps passing. The wind if there was wind, the day released, the ration book in the kitchen drawer, the factory shift tomorrow, the letter to be written, all of it there for the morning. For now, the dark, the quiet, the specific release of having been managing things all day and being, at last, not managing anything. Sleep, as simple and as necessary as that, as it is for you. Right now, the managing is done for today. The ration is what it is. The letter will be written when it can be written. The morning will bring what it brings. And tonight is for this. The dark, the quiet, the sleep. Good night. for those still awake. The night is long and the civilian war has more to tell, so let us continue. Let us think about the children who grew up during the Second World War, in the countries most affected by it, had a specific and in some ways peculiar childhood experience. The war was not something that happened at a distance, while their real childhood continued undisturbed. The war was the background of their childhood, the constant context in which everything else happened. The British children who had been evacuated, sent from the cities to rural areas to escape the bombing, experienced the displacement that the evacuation involved. To be sent away from home, from parents, from the familiar city streets, to live with strangers in the countryside was an experience that varied widely depending on the child and the hosts. Some evacuees were welcomed warmly and flourished in the rural environment. Others were less fortunate, placed with families who took the evacuation payment and provided the minimum. The children who returned to their city homes when the immediate bombing threat receded lived the daily civilian life we're describing. The school that continued through the war, often in disrupted conditions, school buildings requisitioned, classes reorganized, teachers absent because they were in the forces, the rationing that applied to children as to adults, the children's ration books managed by their mothers. The children's experience of the ration was the child's experience of whatever was normal. A child who had grown up knowing nothing but the national loaf and the margarine and the powdered egg had a different relationship to these things than an adult who remembered the white bread and the fresh egg of peacetime. For the child, this was simply food. For the adult, it was always somewhat against the reference point of what had been. Children participated in the wartime economy in various ways. Collecting waste paper and metal for salvage, another of the wartime campaigns that organized the civilian population's contribution to the war effort, was something children did as a matter of course. The salvage collection was organized in some areas with the kind of enthusiasm that children bring to collective projects, the competitive element of collecting more than the next street, adding energy to what was also a genuine contribution to the materials economy. The Dig for Victory allotments were sometimes partly managed by older children. The kitchen garden with its carrots and potatoes was a family project in many households. The children involved in the weeding and the harvesting in ways that were educational as well as useful. And then there was the Anderson shelter, which deserves its own discussion. The Anderson shelter was a small corrugated iron structure, partially buried in the back garden and covered with soil, designed to provide protection during air raids. Millions was distributed to British households before and during the Blitz, and their presence in the back garden was one of the most characteristic features of the wartime British home. The Anderson shelter was not comfortable. It was small, typically about 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. Enough for a family to crouch in but not to stand in or lie down comfortably. It was cold, being largely below ground. It was damp because the damp of the soil worked through the corrugated metal. In the summer it was hot, but it provided real protection. The design was effective at protecting occupants from the blast and fragmentation of bombs that fell nearby, and many families who used their Anderson shelters during raids survived incidents that would have been more dangerous without the shelter. The specific experience of sitting in the Anderson shelter during a raid, in the dark, listening to the sounds overhead, the thump of distant bombs, the sound of anti-aircraft fire, The particular wailing of the all-clear siren when the raid was over was one of the more vivid memories of many who went through the Blitz. But raids were not every night, and the time between raids was the ordinary daily civilian life we are describing. The Anderson shelter in the garden was a feature of the landscape, a reminder that something was happening, but most nights it was unused. The children played around the Anderson shelter in the daytime. It became part of the garden furniture, the corrugated iron sides and the earth mounded over the top, providing a small hill to climb, a space to hide in, a feature that the children incorporated into their play, as children incorporate whatever is in their environment into play. This is the specific quality of childhood in wartime, the adaptability of children to whatever the environment offers, the incorporation of the extraordinary into the ordinary, the war-made background by the habituating capacity of the young. Let us now think about what people did with their leisure time during the war, because even under wartime conditions, some leisure time existed. The cinema was one of the most important leisure institutions of the wartime period, in Britain and in the United States and in other countries where films were widely shown. The cinema was a place to go, a place to be transported for an hour or two into a different story, and the wartime film industry produced a steady supply of entertainment, dramas, comedies, musicals, and the wartime films that addressed the war directly, sometimes with great artistry. British cinema attendance during the war was enormous, higher than in the peacetime years before or after. The cinema provided warmth, fuel permitting, light within, entertainment, and above all the specific experience of sitting in the dark watching a story that was not your own. For people managing the daily weight of the wartime civilian life, this transportation was valued. The films shown in cinemas during the war were preceded by newsreels, short factual films covering the war news, produced by the newsreel companies and shown before the main feature. The newsreel was another way in which civilians consumed news of the war, and the newsreel footage of battles and campaigns and victory celebrations gave visual form to the news that the radio and the newspapers also carried. Reading was another leisure activity, and libraries saw increased use during the war. The public library was free, and books were entertainment, education, and escape simultaneously. The specific books that people read during the war varied. Some sought escape in novels, others sought understanding in histories or political books, others simply read what was available. Walking was perhaps the most universal leisure activity, partly because it required nothing, and partly because fuel restrictions meant that motor vehicles were less available for pleasure use. The countryside around British cities was explored by people who in peacetime might have driven to their destinations, and who now, without adequate petrol, walked. The wartime walk was not always purely pleasurable. The ration, the factory shift, the management of the household, but it was part of the rhythm of the wartime life, the opportunity for movement and for the specific perspective that walking provided on both the landscape and the thoughts. Now let us think about the food in more detail, because the wartime food deserves the attention. The British Ministry of Food's nutritional strategy was actually quite sophisticated for its time. The forced adoption of a diet higher in vegetables and lower in meat and fat, not because vegetables were preferred, but because vegetables were more available, turned out to be nutritionally advantageous in specific ways. The British population's health indicators, as measured by the wartime statistics, showed in some respects an improvement over the pre-war period. Lower rates of certain diet-related conditions, better infant health in some categories, improved average nutrition for the poorest sections of the population who had been under-eating before the war. This is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of the wartime civilian experience, that the shared privation of rationing, which reduced everyone's food consumption from the pre-war level, was for a significant portion of the population actually an improvement on what they had been eating. The poor of the pre-war years had been underfed. The ration, while modest, represented a guaranteed minimum that the pre-war food economy had not provided. The recipes that emerged from the wartime constraint were often genuinely good cooking, the limitation forcing ingenuity that produced dishes with real character. The vegetable dishes were sometimes better than the meat dishes they replaced, because they required more attention and more skill to make satisfying. The soups were thick and filling. The pies were inventive. Not always. The powdered egg scramble was what it was. The national loaf was what it was. There were aspects of the wartime diet that were simply inferior to what they replaced, and no amount of ingenuity could make otherwise. The cream cakes that were unavailable, the chocolate that was allocated in small squares, the fresh fruit that was largely absent, these were missed, and their absence was noted. But the overall quality of wartime cooking was not as bad as memory sometimes made it. The diaries and the letters of the period are full of specific meals eaten and enjoyed within the constraints, full of the pleasure of a good pot of vegetable soup or a well-made steak, and kidney pudding stretched with more kidney than usual. The steak and kidney pudding. Let us think about it for a moment, because it is one of those dishes that the wartime ration made in its adapted form, and because it is the kind of food that fills a specific kind of hunger at the end of a cold autumn day. The sweet crust, a simple pastry made with flour and suet, the hard fat around the kidneys of beef, which was available even when other fats were scarce because butchers often had it. The filling, less steak than the recipe traditionally called for, but the kidneys adequate, the stock good from whatever bones could be obtained, the onion from the garden. The pudding steamed over the kitchen range for 2 hours, the crust becoming dense and satisfying. At the dinner table, the family eating this, not a bad dinner, not a dinner that required apology, a real dinner made from what was available, hot and filling and appropriate to the season. This is the wartime civilian experience at its best. The making of the most from what is available, the finding of genuine satisfaction within the limits. And at the end of this dinner, the clearing of the table, the washing of the dishes in the minimum of hot water, because hot water also required fuel, the putting away, and the evening, and the radio, and the fire burning down, and the bed, and sleep, as necessary and as available as it always is, regardless of the ration and the queue, and the factory shift and the blackout and the management of everything that wartime demanded to be managed. The body's need for sleep was not rationed. It came in the same quantities as before the war. It was as available in the dark bedroom as any peacetime sleep. More available, perhaps, in the specific way that exhaustion makes sleep easy. And you, in your own bed, in your own night, after your own day, you also have the full allocation, unrationed, unlimited, available, now. Good night. The cue in more detail. Let us stay with the cue a little longer, because the queue was so central to the wartime civilian experience. The queue was not always for rationed goods. There was also the queue for the things that were not rationed but were scarce. Things that became available sporadically and without warning, and whose arrival in a shop triggered the rapid formation of the queue. Oranges were one such thing. Oranges before the war had been a common enough fruit in Britain. The disruption of trade routes and the prioritization of shipping for military supplies meant that oranges were rare during the war. When they appeared in a greengrocer's, the queue that formed could be long. The allocation was limited, perhaps 1 orange per customer, or 2, or whatever the supply allowed. Each person in the queue calculated as they waited whether there would be enough to reach the front before the supply was exhausted. The children's priority for the orange. Oranges were one of the few fruits that kept their import priority in the rationing system specifically because of their vitamin C content, which was considered important for children's health. Adults were sometimes discouraged from purchasing oranges in order to leave the limited supply for children. Bananas disappeared almost entirely from the British wartime diet. Their importation from the tropics was essentially suspended for the duration. The story of British children who had no memory of bananas, who, when they finally tasted one after the war, were uncertain what to do with it, became one of the representative anecdotes of the wartime civilian experience. The queue for fish. Fish was not rationed, which made it an appealing supplement to the meat ration. But fish was scarce because the fishing industry had been severely disrupted. Fishing boats had been requisitioned, fishing grounds had been mined or were in dangerous waters. The North Sea fishery was largely closed. When a fishmonger received a delivery of fresh fish, herrings, cod, plaice, the queue formed quickly. The queue for fish was often the longest and the most fiercely maintained queue, because the potential supplement to the protein ration was significant. The fishmonger's skill at allocating the limited supply fairly, giving each person a reasonable portion, not too much, so that those at the back of the queue were not left with nothing, was a form of small authority that the wartime civilian life granted to those managing scarce goods. There was also the queue for off-ration luxuries. Cosmetics were not rationed but were scarce. As manufacturing capacity shifted to war production, lipstick, powder, face cream, these became occasional rather than readily available. The phrase make do and mend had its cosmetic dimension. Women who wanted to maintain a presentable appearance during the war period developed their own alternatives, their own economies of the limited supplies available. The queue for the cosmetic purchase was perhaps less critical than the queue for food, but it was not without significance. The maintenance of appearance, of looking presentable, of not allowing the war's privations to reduce the person to visible shabbiness, was a form of resilience, an assertion of continuing self-respect against the eroding conditions of the war. The British government eventually recognised this explicitly. A cosmetics industry that had been briefly considered entirely dispensable was acknowledged to have a contribution to morale, and a minimum production of certain items was maintained. Stockings. The nylon stocking was an American innovation that had been introduced just before the war and had immediately become enormously popular. The war stopped the supply. The gravy and eyebrow pencil stocking, a seam drawn up the back of the bare leg with an eyebrow pencil, the skin treated with gravy browning or similar to give the appearance of nylon, was the Wartime Substitute and its production before going out for an important occasion was one of the more comic tragic aspects of the wartime civilian experience. And then the queue for whatever had arrived, the patient standing, the slow movement forward, the calculation of supply versus position, the reaching of the front, the purchase, the carrying home of what had been obtained, and the management of it, and the next queue at the next shop for the next shortage. This was the civilian war, unglamorous, persistent, requiring a specific kind of patient ingenuity. And now you're at the end of the day's queue, at the front, having obtained what this particular day offered, and the house is warm enough, and the bed is there, and the ration is managed for today. Sleep, good night. The letters between people, the letters of the wartime period deserve more time, because letters were so central to the experience of those who wrote and received them. A letter from a husband at the front to his wife at home, or from a mother to her son in the forces, was not simply communication. It was proof of continued existence. It was a thread of connection across a gap that seemed enormously wide, and that was genuinely dangerous on at least one end. The person who received the letter read it many times, not just once. The first reading was a reading for information and for the specific tone of the writer. Was he all right? Did he seem well? Was there anything between the lines that suggested otherwise? The censor had removed specific information, but the emotional texture of the letter, the references to missing home, the small observations about what daily life was like, the specific things asked about, conveyed a great deal. The subsequent readings were a different kind of reading, a return to the presence of the writer, the specific voice on the page, the confirmation of a relationship that the physical distance made abstract. Letters to people in the forces were written with a similar awareness. The writer knew the letter would be censored, knew that specific topics, the writer's location, any military information, anything that might be useful to the enemy, would be removed. This knowledge shaped the letter. Not a general self-censorship that removed all content, but a navigation around the prohibited that still produced a genuine communication. What went into the letters was the fabric of ordinary civilian life, the garden, the family, the news of the street, the small events that defined the ongoing life that the soldier had left behind and was fighting to preserve. These small events were not trivial filler. They were the content that connected the soldier to home, that maintained the reality of the world he was away from. A letter that said, "The runner beans have come in well this year, and there are enough to last until September. Mrs. Wilson next door had her sister visiting, and they managed to get some real coffee from somewhere, and we all had a cup. Little Tommy has a place in the grammar school, and you should have seen how pleased he was." This letter, filled with the ordinary news of the civilian life, was the most important thing Margaret could send. And when she received the letter back, censored, regimental postmark, the handwriting that she knew as well as her own, she read it as many times as the days allowed. The letter kept in the drawer, the bundle of letters tied with string that accumulated over the months and years, the most valuable thing in the house after the children, the letters, and now the house is quiet, the children are asleep, the letter in its drawer, and sleep is here, which is also a kind of patience, the waiting for the next letter, managed through the sleep, the night passing as it passes, and the morning on the other side of it. with whatever it brings. Good night. The allotment. The allotment, a piece of public land rented to individuals for vegetable growing, was one of the more quietly important institutions of wartime British civilian life. Allotments had existed before the war, particularly in industrial cities where most residents had no garden of their own. The Dig for Victory campaign vastly expanded the allotment system, pressing into cultivation public parks, roadsides, railway embankments, the grounds of schools and churches, any piece of land that could grow food. The allotment culture that developed was its own small community. Men who worked long factory hours found time on summer evenings and weekend mornings to dig their plots. Women maintained their allotments alongside the household garden. The conversation across the allotment fence was the conversation of people with a shared practical project, the exchange of knowledge and seeds and surplus produce. The specific knowledge required for allotment gardening, which varieties grew best in the specific soil of this particular plot, when to plant, how to manage the pests, how to store the harvest, was the same practical embodied knowledge that had been the province of professional gardeners before the war, and was now distributed among the amateur gardeners of the wartime allotment system. The potato was perhaps the most important allotment crop. Potatoes provided calories, could be grown in relatively poor soil, stored well, and were the basis of a great many wartime meals. The potato pie, the bubble and squeak, made from leftover boiled potato and cabbage, the potato soup, the baked potato. The potato appeared in many forms, and the allotment that produced a good potato crop was a significant contribution to the household's food security. The digging of the potato bed was one of the satisfying outdoor tasks of the wartime allotment. You put your fork into the earth, you turned the soil, the potatoes appeared. Each forkful that revealed potatoes rather than just earth was a small, specific satisfaction. Margaret had her allotment, a short walk from the house. On Sunday mornings, when she was not at the factory and the immediate household tasks were managed, she went to the allotment and spent 2 hours there, weeding primarily. The weeds grew faster than the vegetables and required constant management, checking the state of the crops, harvesting what was ready. The allotment in the early autumn was the best season, the harvest of the summer's growth, the runner beans heavy on their poles, the courgettes to be cut before they became marrows, the potatoes to be lifted and stored, the first winter cabbages beginning to heart up. The specific pleasure of the harvest, the cutting of what had grown, the collecting of what was produced, was one of the genuine compensations of wartime allotment gardening. You had grown this. It would feed the household, a connection between effort and result that the managed, rationed, queued civilian life of the city did not always provide. The allotment produced a different kind of tiredness from the factory work. Not the standing at the bench tiredness of repetitive industrial work, but the outdoor tiredness of physical labour in the open air, the back and the arms having done work in the garden's specific mode. A good tiredness, the right kind of tiredness for the end of a Sunday. Margaret came home from the allotment with her basket of vegetables, made a meal from what she had brought, sat by the fire as the evening cooled, and slept well, as you can sleep well after whatever your day's work was, the outdoor kind or the indoor kind, the physical or the other, the tiredness that has been earned and the sleep that follows it, right here. Good night. The BBC, the BBC during the Second World War was one of the most important institutions in British public life, and it deserves more than the brief mention it has received. The BBC's approach to its wartime role was shaped by its understanding of what the public needed. Not propaganda in the crude sense of falsification. The BBC early in the war established a reputation for honest reporting of difficult news, including defeats and setbacks, that distinguished it from the state broadcasting systems of totalitarian countries. This honesty built trust, and the trust was one of the BBC's most important assets. The 9 o'clock news was listened to by the majority of the adult British population. The measured voice of the BBC announcer, names were given for the newsreaders during the war, in a departure from the BBC's previous practice of anonymity, partly to reassure listeners that the voices they trusted were real and present, delivered the day's news with a composure that many listeners found steadying. But the BBC was more than the news. The variety programmes, the comedy shows, the classical music concerts, the drama productions, the full range of broadcasting that the BBC maintained through the war was part of how people managed the sustained stress of wartime civilian life. Music While You Work, broadcast twice daily to factory workers, was a programme specifically designed for the wartime factory environment. Light music, played continuously at a tempo that was found to maintain productivity and mood simultaneously. The research behind this programme, the discovery that certain tempos and certain types of music had measurable effects on factory productivity, was an early application of what we would now call organisational psychology to the industrial workplace. Workers' playtime, broadcast from factory canteens, brought live entertainment to the workers, comedians, singers, variety acts, performing for an audience of factory workers on their lunch break. The performance broadcast live to factories across the country. The audience's laughter and applause was part of the programme, a reminder that there were real people in real places managing the same things you were managing and finding humour in it. The In Town Tonight programme, which continued through the war, brought to listeners the sounds of London, the accents, the conversations, the ordinary life of the city persisting through the war. This was reassurance of a specific kind. London was still there, still functioning, still producing the ordinary street life of a great city. The programmes that addressed children directly, Children's Hour in the late afternoon, maintained a version of childhood entertainment through the war years, the specific world of the children's programme providing a space that was, as much as possible, separate from the war. Margaret listened to the radio as the background of her evening. The specific programmes varied. The news was the anchor. Around it, whatever was available and appealing. The radio's voice in the sitting room, the fire's warmth, the knitting's rhythm, the evening winding down, and then the quiet, and the night, and sleep, which the radio had helped organise in its own way. The day's final entertainment consumed, the news absorbed, the mind given what it needed to release the day. And now the radio is off, and the sitting room is dark, and the blackout curtains are closed, and the bed is upstairs, and sleep is there. Good night. The night. This story ends. Every wartime night eventually became a peacetime night. The specific nights of the Second World War, the nights of the queue, and the ration, and the factory shift, and the blackout curtain, and the letter in the drawer, eventually ended. The war ended, and the specific civilian experience of the war ended with it. VE Day in May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, was celebrated in British cities with a release of energy that was the accumulated pressure of 6 years finding its exit. The blackout lights came on, the streets lit for the first time in years. The sirens that had sounded so many warnings were silent permanently. People gathered in the streets and celebrated. But VE Day was also complicated. The war in the Pacific continued for several months. Many families were still waiting for the return of their servicemen and women. The rationing continued. In fact, some rationing became more severe after the war, as the economy adjusted to peace, and as the need to support the rebuilt Europe with food competed with the domestic supply. Bread rationing, which had not been imposed during the war itself, was introduced briefly in 1946. The full return to peacetime conditions took years, not months. The specifics of the wartime civilian life, the ration book, the queue for scarce goods, the making do with substitutes, persisted in various forms for several years after the fighting stopped. But the war itself was over. The blackout was over. The specific daily anxiety of the war, the awareness that everything might at any moment change dramatically, that the ordinary day you were managing was occurring within a vast and dangerous disruption, gradually faded. The ordinary became ordinary again, rather than the specific achievement it had been during the war. And Margaret slept without the background anxiety that the war had provided. Simply slept. In the dark that was no longer the blackout, but simply the dark. In the quiet that was no longer the wartime quiet, but simply the quiet. The ordinary sleep of a peacetime night, which is what you have. Tonight, the ordinary sleep, the peacetime dark, the quiet that is simply the quiet, after the day that is simply a day, and the sleep that comes as sleep has always come, without rationing, without limitation, available in full. Now, take it. Good night. The neighbours. The neighbourhood in wartime was a different kind of neighbourhood from the peacetime one. Before the war, the neighbourhood was simply the neighbourhood. The houses on the street, the people you knew by face and by name and by the ordinary, amount that neighbours know about each other. The wars between households in terms of social distance and connection were the ordinary wars of ordinary proximity. Some people were close, some were friendly, some were distant, some were actively avoided. The war changed the neighbourhood, or changed some neighbourhoods, in the direction of greater mutual knowledge and greater mutual dependence. The shared experience of the Blitz, the nights in the communal shelter, if the neighbourhood had a communal shelter, or the nights when you heard the raid from your Anderson shelter and emerged in the morning to check on the street, created a specific intimacy. You knew who had been bombed out. You knew who had lost someone. You knew whose house had been damaged and whose had been spared. This knowledge was more immediate and more personal than most neighbourhood knowledge tends to be. The ARP warden was a neighbourhood institution. The air raid warden, typically a man too old for military service or in a reserved occupation, patrolled the street at night, checked the blackout, directed people to shelters during raids, reported damage and casualties to the warden's post. This person knew the street in a specific way, the layout of every house, the household's composition, who was elderly and might need assistance, where the water supply connections were. The warden was often a neighbour who had taken on this additional role, and his knowledge of the street was built from both ordinary neighbourly acquaintance and the specific knowledge that the warden's role required. He was a community figure in the wartime sense, not a bureaucrat, but a neighbour with additional responsibility. The street party, the neighbourhood celebration organised at various wartime occasions and most fully at V-Day, expressed the community that the war had created or intensified. The tables set in the street, the food shared from whatever the household's limited supplies could contribute, the children running and playing in the space that was normally the domain of vehicles, the adults gathered in a specific holiday mood. This was the neighbourhood expressing itself as a community, the sense of shared experience finding a collective outlet. Not every street was like this. Some neighbourhoods remained fragments of individual households that happened to share a street without much genuine community. The war did not universally create community. It created the conditions in which community could form, but whether it did depended on the specific people and the specific circumstances. Margaret Street was one where community had formed. She knew her neighbours, she relied on them, and was relied upon in the specific ways that the war made necessary. The sharing of childcare when the factory shifts conflicted, the exchange of ration coupons when one household had a surplus of one item and a deficit of another, the practical help when someone received bad news, the neighbourhood at night, after the blackout, in the specific quiet of the dark street, was the neighbourhood at rest. The houses were dark, the blackout effective, the street quiet. But behind the dark windows, behind the blackout curtains, the houses held their people, living their wartime lives, managing their rations, reading their letters, and sleeping. Each house a small world, the whole street a larger world, the city beyond, the country beyond that, and all of it at rest, in the night, as you are at rest, in your own small world, behind your own windows, in the quiet of your own night. Good night. The children's beds. Let us spend a moment with the children's beds. In Margaret's house, the two children sleep in the upstairs bedroom, the smaller room, with two narrow beds side by side, and the window that looks over the back garden and the allotment beyond. The blackout curtains on the window are the same heavy dark material as everywhere else. The curtains are closed. The room is dark. The children are asleep. The specific sleep of children who have done their schoolwork and eaten their dinner and had their bath, when the hot water and the fuel allowed it, and been told their story and said their good night. Children's sleep in wartime was complicated by certain things. The raids, when they happened, interrupted sleep, and sometimes, in the early Blitz period, made sleeping at home impractical. Families spent nights in the public shelter or the Anderson. The anxiety that even children absorbed from the adult world around them, the careful listening to adult conversations, the sense that something important and not entirely controllable was happening, was not absent from the children's experience. But the resilience of children to the conditions around them was also real and much remarked upon. The children who slept through the occasional distant raid, who adapted to the Anderson shelter when needed and slept there as they would have slept anywhere, who carried on with school and with play and with the ordinary preoccupations of childhood despite the war's presence. This resilience was not indifference. It was the specific adaptability of minds that do not yet have the full adult framework for what is happening, and that process the present primarily through the immediate and the sensory, rather than through the historical and the political. The small children for whom the war was the only world they had known simply lived in it, as children live in whatever world they are given. They are asleep now, the breathing even, the faces peaceful in the dark. Margaret looked at them before she went to her own room, the specific peace of sleeping children, which is one of the more specific consolations available, whatever else was happening. The children asleep, in their beds, peacefully, and now you are also in yours, or going to yours, the same peace available, the same quiet, the same dark, the same sleep. Good night. The food one more time. The wartime food is worth one more return because it is one of the places where the civilian experience was most concretely and most daily felt. Breakfast, the national loaf, which was made from wholemeal or near wholemeal flour, dense and slightly grey, with a texture and flavour that was distinctly different from the white bread of peacetime. Spread thinly with whatever fat was available. Butter, if the ration had not run out. Margarine, if it had. Perhaps a scraping of marmalade from the jar that was carefully managed. The cup of tea, weaker than the pre-war cup, poured from a pot that had been steeped long enough to extract maximum flavour from the minimum tea. This was breakfast, 5 days a week or more. Not unpleasant, not terrible. Simply the breakfast of the wartime household, the food that was available, prepared and eaten without excessive commentary. Dinner, the midday meal, which in the working-class British households was traditionally the main meal of the day. In 1942 and 1943, the British restaurant was one of the innovations that addressed the midday meal problem for workers and for those managing on limited domestic rations. British restaurants were publicly run canteen-style eating places, established in town halls and community centres and converted buildings, offering simple hot meals at a fixed and affordable price and without requiring ration coupons. The British restaurant meal was not gourmet. It was a practical hot meal, a meat or vegetable main dish, a starchy component, a pudding. But it provided a hot midday meal for people who could not manage it domestically, and it provided it without using ration coupons, which was a significant practical advantage. The factory canteen served a similar function for workers. A hot meal at midday, produced in bulk, the nutritional requirements met, if not the aesthetic ones. The evening meal, prepared at home, from the available ration components, a stew of root vegetables, the parsnips and swede and carrots from the garden, thickened with barley or lentils with whatever scraps of meat the ration allowed floating in it. A dumpling made from the little sweet that was available, steamed on top of the stew and absorbing the flavour of the broth, or the leftover cooked potato from last night, mashed together with whatever cooked green vegetable remained, fried in a little dripping in the pan until crispy. Bubble and squeak, named for the sounds it made in the pan. Or the Woolton pie, the vegetable pie of the Ministry of Food's devising, its pastry crust made from the national flour, the filling of whatever vegetables were in season, the whole thing baked until the pastry was just set and the filling was hot throughout. These meals were adequate. They provided the calories. They were hot and they were filling. They were made with some care and some knowledge of how to make the available ingredients as good as possible, and at the table they were eaten with appetite by people who had done a day's work and whose bodies needed the fuel. Not the dinner of the pre-war household, but the dinner of the wartime household, which was sufficient, as all sufficient things are sufficient, and the sufficient dinner eaten, and the table cleared, and the sitting room and the radio and the knitting and the evening, and then the bed and sleep, which is also sufficient, which is all you need tonight. Good night. The ordinary life continued. The point that this story has been making in all its detail and all its slowness is that ordinary life continued. Through the rationing and the hue, through the factory shift and the allotment, through the blackout and the Anderson shelter, through the letters from the front and the anxiety of the waiting, through the years of managed shortages and adapted recipes and maintained routines, ordinary life continued. Not the same as before, changed in specific and significant ways, but recognizably life, with its daily rhythms and its social connections and its private pleasures and its small satisfactions. The cup of tea that was slightly weaker than before was still tea. The meal that had less meat than before was still a meal. The film at the cinema that provided 2 hours of transported attention was still a film. The same pleasure it had always been. People loved each other during the war. They had children during the war. They made friends and kept friends and fell out with friends and made up with friends. They were funny, and they were serious, and they were petty, and they were generous, in the ordinary proportions that people are all these things. The war was the background, the context, the constraint within which the ordinary human life continued. It was not the whole of life for the civilian at home, it was the conditions of life, and the conditions managed with the specific practicality that the wartime British and German and American and Japanese and other civilian populations demonstrated, were managed. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without loss, but managed day after day, week after week, for years. This is the ordinary civilian experience of the Second World War. The ration book and the queue and the factory shift and the allotment and the BBC and the letters and the neighbours and the sleep. The sleep that came every night regardless. The sleep that restored the person who was managing all of it. The sleep that was the one reliable thing that the wartime civilian life provided in full measure. Because no war rations sleep. No war requires the giving up of the night's rest. The night comes, and with it the opportunity for the full allocation of rest, which is here, tonight, for you, in your peacetime night, your dark, your quiet, your unrationed, unlimited, fully available sleep. Take it, all of it. It belongs to you. Good night. The long continuity. All the civilians of the Second World War, the women managing the rationed households, the men doing essential work, the children growing up in the wartime context, the elderly living through a second Great War, they are now in the distance of history. The specific things they managed, the specific rations, the specific shortages, the specific anxieties of that specific war, are over. The war ended. The ration books were collected. The blackout curtains came down. The Anderson shelters were dug up from the gardens. The ordinary life resumed its peacetime character. But the people who lived through it were changed by having lived through it, in ways both visible and invisible. They knew what it was to manage without. They knew what it was to be part of a community managing a shared difficulty. They knew what ordinary things were worth, having experienced their scarcity or their absence. They brought this knowledge into the peace, and it shaped them, and through them it shaped the post-war world. As every experience shapes the person who has it, including tonight's experience, including this slow, detailed, unhurried account of the civilian wartime life, which you have been moving through, in the dark, as the night has progressed, and the night has progressed, and sleep is very close now, or perhaps already here. The story has done its work or is finishing it. The cup of tea in the sitting room is cold, the fire is down, the ration book is in the kitchen drawer, the blackout curtains are closed, and the night holds everything, as the night always holds everything. All the people in all the darkened houses, all the people managing their lives and their anxieties and their small daily necessities, all of them in the dark, all of them needing exactly this, the sleep that the night provides, which is here, now, take it. The long continuity of all those who slept through their difficulties and woke to continue managing them. You're in the continuity, managing your version, and tonight resting from it, as they rested in the dark, in the quiet, in the sleep. Good night. The market town, on a weekday. Not all wartime civilian life was in the cities. The market towns of rural Britain, the villages, the agricultural counties. These places also had their civilian war, different from the city experience in specific ways. The rural civilians' ration was the same ration as the urban civilians, but the supplementation was easier. The farmer's wife who kept chickens had eggs. The rural household with access to a kitchen garden had more space and more reliable growing conditions than the cramped urban plot. The countryside produced food, and those who lived in it had some access to things that were effectively unavailable to city dwellers. The rabbit that could be caught, the hedgerow fruit that could be gathered, the occasional surplus from the farm, the land girl, the member of the Women's Land Army who was sent to fill the agricultural labour shortage left by men entering the forces, was another feature of the rural wartime. Young women from the cities, assigned to farms, learning to milk cows and drive tractors and dig ditches and do the enormous physical work of the wartime farm. Many of these women had never been near a farm before. The adjustment was significant. The early mornings, the weather, the specific knowledge of agricultural work that had to be learned from scratch, the rural culture that was different from the urban culture they knew. But they came in large numbers, and they did the work, and the farms kept producing. The village pub was the rural equivalent of the urban community centre, the place where people gathered, where news was exchanged, where the social life of the community expressed itself. The beer was sometimes weak, malt and hops were in constrained supply, but the pub remained open and remained a focal point. The village church continued its services. The congregation somewhat depleted by those away in the forces, the vicar often maintaining contact with the families of the parish's soldiers, reading from the pulpit the news that letters reported. The rural evening was darker than the urban evening in good times, and in the blackout it was very dark indeed. A village on an overcast night with the blackout in force was dark in the way that has become unusual in the modern world. The specific, complete darkness of a place without artificial light, where the only illumination was whatever the moon and stars provided. In this darkness, the rural civilian's evening was an evening by the fire and the radio, the same as the urban civilians, but with the particular quality of the darkness outside that the countryside produced, and sleep came in the rural evening as it came everywhere. The same dark, the same quiet, the same release of the day. Good night. What people read, books that people read during the wartime years were various, and what people chose to read said something about what they needed from reading. Escape was valued. The novel that took you entirely out of the present and into a different time or place. Historical fiction, adventure stories, romances provided the mental vacation that the sustained difficulty of wartime life made appealing. Georgette Heyer's Regency romances were enormously popular. The specific pleasure of the Regency world's social comedies providing reliable transport. Mystery stories flourished. Agatha Christie continued to write and be read throughout the war. Dorothy L. Sayers. The detective story's specific structure, a problem presented, a process of investigation, a solution achieved, had an appeal in wartime that went beyond the intrinsic quality of the stories. The problem that was resolved, the world restored to order, the ending that made sense. These were satisfactions that the war itself did not reliably provide, and the detective story provided them in each small volume. Non-fiction about the war was read by those who wanted to understand what was happening. Histories of earlier campaigns, analyses of strategy, the occasional account by someone who had been somewhere and had written about it. These were read with the attention of people who had a personal stake in the larger situation. Poetry was read, particularly the poetry that addressed the war and the human dimensions of it. The poets of the First World War, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, were read with new attention by people living through a second war, the First War's poets speaking across the years to conditions that had some parallels, and the Bible was read. Church attendance was higher during the war than in the preceding peacetime years, and the reading of the Bible by people seeking comfort or meaning, or simply the specific quality of attention that ancient scripture provides was part of the wartime civilians' relationship with their faith. The library's queue was a different queue from the grocer's queue, but a queue nonetheless. Books were borrowed and returned and borrowed again. The same copy read by many hands. The book in the hands on the evening. The story that was not about the war, or the one that was, the one that explained what was happening and made it slightly less uncontrollable, and then the book closed, and the evening ended, and the bed, and the sleep, which was also a kind of reading, the night story, the dreams and the rest, and the morning with its continuation, good night, the specific sound of the all-clear siren, not the rising and falling wail of the air raid warning, which produced the need for action, the movement to the shelter, the organization of the household for the raid. The all-clear was different, a continuous steady note, not rising and falling, but sustained at a single pitch. The all-clear meant the raid was over. Those who were awake when the all-clear sounded heard it as relief. The specific quality of the relief depended on where they had been and what the raid had been. If they had been in the shelter, the all-clear meant they could come out, return to the house, assess whatever damage had or had not occurred, and go back to bed if the hour permitted. If they had been asleep and the all-clear woke them, the relief was slightly disoriented. You woke not having heard the warning, woke to the all-clear's sound and the awareness that a raid had happened while you slept, and the checking. Is the house intact? Are the children fine? Was conducted in the particular confused state of the suddenly and unexpectedly woken. But mostly, as the war went on and the raids became less frequent in many parts of the country, the all-clear was simply a sound in the night that was not the warning. Its steady note a confirmation that the danger, if it had been present, was past. Not every night had a raid. Most nights, by the middle years of the war, did not. The warning that would have triggered the all clear did not sound because the bombers did not come. On those nights the night was simply the night. No warning, no all clear, no shelter. Simply the dark and the quiet. Simply the bed. Simply the sleep. The sleep that came not as relief from a raid, but as the ordinary end of the ordinary day, which is the sleep that is available now, the ordinary sleep, the unremarkable sleep, the sleep that comes without drama, simply because the night is here, and the body needs it, and it is available. Good night. The Women's Institutes and the Women's Voluntary Service. Two organisations of wartime civilian life in Britain that deserve a mention, the Women's Institute and the Women's Voluntary Service. The Women's Institute, the rural women's organisation that had existed since 1915, found a new purpose during the war as a hub for the preservation of food and the organisation of rural women's contribution to the war effort. WI members jam making, preserving, producing, organising. The jam. The WI's jam making during the war was not a small domestic operation. The preservation centres that the WI established, working with the government's fruit collection scheme, processed enormous quantities of fruit that might otherwise have been wasted into jam that supplemented the ration. The soft fruit that gardens and countryside produced in summer, the gooseberries, the black currants, the plums, was collected, brought to the preservation centres, and turned into the jam that the jam ration could not adequately provide. The work was physical and sustained. The cutting and preparing of fruit, the sterilising of jars, the supervision of the boiling jam that had to reach its setting point and be potted quickly. The skills involved were the domestic skills of preservation, elevated into a wartime industrial operation by the organisation and the scale. The jam produced was distributed through the rationing system. Each jar was a real contribution to the food supply. The Women's Voluntary Service was an organisation specifically created for the wartime emergency, organised to support the civilian population through the Blitz and the various crises of the wartime period. WVS members ran mobile canteens that appeared at bombed-out areas to provide food and tea to those who had been made homeless or who were working in the rescue operations. They organised the billeting of evacuees. They ran first aid points and rest centres. They organised the salvage collections and the various other voluntary efforts that the war generated. The WVS uniform, green and burgundy, became a familiar sight in wartime Britain, the women in it associated with practical help in difficult circumstances. These organisations, and there were many others, in various countries performing the same functions, were expressions of the civilian community organising itself to address the demands of the wartime situation, not organised from above, or not only from above, but driven by the people themselves, the women specifically, who saw what needed to be done and did it. Margaret was a WVS member. She was on the rota for the mobile canteen. One evening a week she was at the WVS station, helping to prepare the canteen for its round, the large urns of tea, the supplies of sandwiches and biscuits that would go to wherever they were needed that night. This was additional work on top of the household management and the factory shifts and the allotment. Where the time came from was a question that wartime women were often asked and had difficulty answering. The time came from somewhere. It always comes from somewhere when the thing that needs doing is genuinely important. And in the morning, after the WVC evening she slept, tired, in the specific way that giving a lot produces tiredness, but also in the specific way that giving a lot produces satisfaction. The sleep after a well-spent day, the most restful kind. Good night. The tea one more time. We have mentioned tea many times in this story, and in the story about the soldier, and they deserve to appear here one final time, because tea in the Second World War civilian experience was not merely a beverage. The cup of tea that was handed to someone who had been bombed out, or who had received bad news, or who was cold and tired after a long shift, was a physical gesture with a content beyond the liquid it delivered. It was the gesture of care, the acknowledgement that you had been seen, and that something was being done, however small, in response to your difficulty. The tea that was made in the kitchen when the bad news telegram arrived. This was not because tea helped against bad news. Tea does not help against bad news. But making tea was something to do. It was the reaching for the kettle and the teapot and the ritual of the familiar in the face of something that resisted all response as a way of being present and doing something. The tea that appeared at the wartime community gatherings, the WVS canteen, the church hall that was used as a rest centre, the factory canteen, was the tea that said, "You are among people who are managing this. You are not alone in it. Here is the hot liquid of the managed ordinary life." The British relationship to tea is sometimes mocked as a cliché, and clichés are clichés for reasons. The specific comfort of a hot, sweet cup of tea in circumstances of difficulty is real, and it was understood to be real in wartime Britain, and that understanding was expressed in the organisational priority given to maintaining the tea supply and the tea habit, even under conditions where other things were more obviously important. Margaret's last cup of tea before bed, weak, sweet, hot. In the sitting room as the fire died, the radio off, the house quiet, the cup lifted and drunk slowly, the warmth of it spreading through the tired body, and then the cup rinsed and set to drain, and the kitchen checked, and the fire banked, and the blackout curtains given their final check, and the stairs, and the bed, and the sleep, which is here for you, after whatever your version of the last cup of tea was, whatever warmth you had before the night. It is enough. It is always enough. The warmth of the cup, and then the warmth of the bed, and then the sleep. Good night. The absolute end of this story. The wartime civilian, the ration book, the queue, the factory, the allotment, the blackout, the BBC, the letters, the tea, the neighbours, the children asleep, the fire banked, the night. All of it described, all of it present in the slow telling that this has been, and now the telling is done, and the wartime civilian is in her bed, and the wartime night is around her, and the morning will come when it comes, and you're in your bed, and your night is around you, and your morning will come when it comes. The same night, different century, the same dark, the same quiet, the same body needing the same thing, which is sleep, which is here, right here, in this moment. Take it, all of it, the full unrationed allocation, the civilian's great advantage over the soldier, the warm bed, the dark that is just dark, the quiet that is just quiet, and the sleep that comes as sleep has always come, to everyone who has ever lain down in the dark at the end of a long day, the long line of them, and you, in the line, sleeping, now. Good night. The sense of time. During the war, The sense of time during the wartime years was particular and worth describing. In ordinary peacetime life, time moves in the ways it has always moved. The seasons cycle, the years accumulate, the present gives way to the future at a pace that feels more or less constant. The future, in peacetime, is generally assumed to resemble the present or to be somewhat better. In wartime, the sense of time changed in specific ways. The future was uncertain in a way that peacetime did not produce. What the world would look like after the war was genuinely unknown, and the war's end was not a date you could put in your diary. It would end when it ended, under conditions that could not be predicted with certainty from within the middle of it. This uncertainty about the future produced a specific relationship with the present. The present, the ration, the queue, the factory shift, the evening by the fire, was what you had. The future was the promise of something better, held carefully, but the present was the reality. There was, in some wartime writing, a specific intensity of the present tense experience. The cup of tea that was drunk with more awareness of its being drunk, the letter that was read with full attention to its every sentence, the evening with the children that was experienced with the consciousness that such evenings were not guaranteed, that the war might end them. This intensity was not constant. Most of the time, ordinary life was lived in the ordinary half-attentive way that ordinary life tends to be lived. The present taken for granted in the way that the present is usually taken for granted. But it surfaced at specific moments, and the moments it surfaced were sometimes the moments of the highest ordinary pleasure. The hot bath that was possible when the fuel allowed, the good meal that the rationing occasionally permitted, the evening of genuine laughter from the radio comedy. These pleasures were experienced with a quality of appreciation that was intensified by the contrast of the general wartime constraint. The specific pleasure was more specifically pleasant because you knew it was specific and not assured. Margaret, drinking her evening tea by the fire, was sometimes aware of drinking it. Not always, but sometimes the specific pleasure of the hot sweet liquid in the tired body was noticed and acknowledged even briefly. This is the gift that difficulty sometimes offers, the sharpened attention to pleasure that difficulty's contrast provides. And now, tonight, the specific pleasure of the warm bed, which you might or might not notice, but which is here, specifically, real, available, sleep in it. Good night, the clothes. The clothing of the wartime civilian was another domain of management and ingenuity. Clothing in Britain was rationed from 1941. Each person received a fixed number of clothing coupons per year, and every item of clothing had a coupon value that had to be surrendered along with the purchase price. A man's suit might cost 26 coupons, a woman's dress might cost 11, a pair of stockings was 2, a pair of shoes was 5. The annual coupon allocation was 66 coupons, reduced in 1942 to 48. Against the coupon values of necessary items, 48, coupons did not go far. A person who needed a coat and a pair of shoes and a dress had already spent most of their annual allowance. The response was the make do and mend culture, officially promoted by the Board of Trade through its Make Do and Mend campaign. The instructions: repair rather than replace, alter existing clothing rather than buying new, knit and sew from whatever materials were available. The wartime clothing that women produced for themselves and their families was not always elegant, but it was often skillfully made. a child's dress made from a man's shirt that had become too worn to wear, a blouse fashioned from curtain fabric, a coat that had been turned, the process of disassembling the coat and reassembling it with the inside out to present the less worn inner surface as the outer surface. The specific domestic skills that the clothing ration called on, the tailoring, the knitting, the darning of worn wool socks rather than replacing them, were skills that many women already had from the pre-war domestic economy, where economy and skill had also been required. The war intensified these skills and extended them to people who had not previously needed them as much. The sewing machine, the domestic sewing machine that was a standard household item in many homes of the period, was one of the more important pieces of civilian wartime equipment. It ran on human foot power. The treadle pedalled to drive the needle, and it produced clothing and repaired clothing and altered clothing throughout the wartime years. Margaret's sewing machine was in the corner of the sitting room. In the evenings, when the knitting was set aside or when a specific garment task required the machine, she sat at the treadle and worked. The specific sound of the treadle machine, the rhythm of the foot on the pedal, the mechanical action of the needle, was one of the sounds of the wartime evening. The clothing, mended and managed and made new from old, was laid out for the morning. The children's school clothes on the chair, her own working clothes for the factory shift, her husband's work trousers, all mended, all adequate, all representing the specific work of managing what was available. And she went to bed and slept in the clothes that were adequate, in the bed that was warm enough, in the night that was dark with the blackout, and in the morning the clothes would be worn again, and the day would continue, as days do, as your day will continue tomorrow. But first, the sleep. Good night. The walk to work. In wartime Britain, the petrol rationing severely restricted the use of private motor vehicles. The private car, which had been growing in availability in the 1930s, was effectively immobilized for the duration. Petrol was available only for essential uses, and personal motoring did not qualify as essential. This meant that most journeys were made by foot, by bicycle, or by public transport. The bicycle became enormously important during the war. A bicycle required no fuel, needed minimal maintenance, and provided a practical means of travel for distances that were too far to walk but too short to justify the complexity of public transport. Bicycle production was a wartime priority. The bicycle factory that had converted to war production continued to produce bicycles alongside its military components because bicycles were themselves a form of war production. They kept the workers moving. Margaret cycled to the factory on the morning she worked. The bicycle was a pre-war model, maintained carefully because replacement parts were difficult to obtain. The tyres were patched rather than replaced. A puncture was repaired rather than left unrepaired because a spare inner tube required coupons and search. The wartime cycle journey was made in the blackout in winter mornings. The bicycle's dynamo lamp powered by the friction of the wheel, giving a small useful light. The streets, dark, familiar. The route cycled so many times that the turns were automatic. Other cyclists, similarly equipped, similarly purposeful, on the same wartime errands. The specific sounds of the wartime morning, the bicycles on the road, the distant factory hooter, the footsteps of those who were walking, the occasional vehicle, and in the afternoon, the cycle home, the familiar route in reverse, the tiredness of the shift in the legs, the evening waiting at the end of the journey. The bicycle propped against the house wall, the door opened, the warmth of the kitchen, home, and the evening that we have described, and the bed, and sleep, the cyclist's sleep, the worker's sleep, the wartime civilian's sleep. Which is your sleep tonight, after whatever journey or day involved, after whatever distance you covered, the tiredness in the legs, or the equivalent, and the bed, and sleep. Good night. The night in a different country. Not all wartime civilian nights were British. In occupied France, the civilian night had its own specific qualities. The German occupation imposed its own curfew. Different from the British blackout, it was a prohibition on civilian movement after a specific hour, rather than simply a light restriction. The occupied French civilian who was out after curfew without authorization risked serious consequences. The occupied Paris of the wartime years was a city living under restriction and under surveillance. The ration was harsher than in Britain, partly because occupied France was also feeding the German military machine from French agricultural production. The shortages were more severe, but the ordinary civilian life continued in its way. The queues for food, the management of the ration, the small negotiations with the available ingredients to make meals that were adequate, the evenings in the apartments, the radio that was the BBC if you were tuned to the right frequency and the right hours, illegal, carrying risk but done. The specific experience of hearing the BBC French service on a radio with the volume kept low in an apartment in occupied Paris, the voice from London confirming that there was a world outside the occupation, that the war was going on, that the Allied forces were somewhere and doing something, was a specific experience of that specific civilian life. And the sleep after this evening was the sleep of an occupied person, with its particular quality, the alertness that occupation imposed, the awareness of the night outside as not the neutral blackout of Britain, but the curfewed night of a city under foreign control. But still sleep, because the body needed sleep regardless, and the morning still came with its own specific requirements. The occupied civilian also managed their day. The French housewife also queued and rationed and managed. The occupied Norwegian, the Dutch civilian, the Belgian, all of them managing their specific versions of the civilian wartime life, all of them sleeping at night, in their specific occupied nights, as you sleep tonight, in your specific night, whatever it is. Good night. The patience. The wartime civilian's essential quality was patience. Not a passive patience, not the patience of someone who had given up trying to affect outcomes. An active patience. The patience of someone who was doing everything that could be done, accepting what could not be changed, and continuing. The queue required patience. Standing in it for 30 minutes when you had other things to do, when the weather was unpleasant, when the supply might run out before you reached the front. This required the specific patience of accepting a situation you had not chosen but that had to be dealt with. The ration required patience. Having less than you wanted, managing with what you had, resisting the fantasy of what you could not have. This was the daily patience of the constrained life, the waiting for. The war to end required patience. Nobody knew how long it would be. Nobody could promise it would be over by any specific date. You managed the present and trusted that the present was moving toward a future that would be better, without knowing when that future would arrive. This large patience, the patience for the duration, was perhaps the most demanding quality of the wartime civilian experience. Not the specific hardships, which were manageable in their specificity. The sustained uncertainty about when the managing would be over. And yet the wartime generations, by and large, found this patience. They developed it through the practice of daily management, through the community of others who were managing the same thing, through the religious and cultural frameworks that supported the endurance of difficulty, through the knowledge that the situation required patience and there was no alternative to providing it. This patience is not fashionable in the modern world. The modern world offers many alternatives to patience. The quick solution, the immediate gratification, the technology that removes the need to wait. But the patience itself as a capacity, the ability to remain present in difficulty without being defeated by it, to continue managing the present without certainty about the future, this remains a valuable thing. And tonight, the specific patience of waiting for sleep. If sleep is not immediate, if the mind has not yet released the day, the patience of lying in the dark and allowing the transition to happen at its own pace, not forcing it, not hurrying it, the patience that sleep requires, which is the same patience the wartime civilian exercised, which is available to you. Now, in the dark, in the quiet, patient, letting the night do what the night does, which is bring sleep, which it always does, in its own time, which is soon. Good night.